The rain fell in silver sheets over the streets of Lagos that Friday evening, drumming against the windows of luxury cars stuck in the traffic outside Ikoyi Plaza. But inside a sleek black Rolls-Royce Phantom, one woman sat unmoving, her breath fogging the glass. Her name was Adaeze Okonkwo, and to the world, she was untouchable. Billionaire, CEO of Okonkwo Holdings. The widow every headline whispered about. The woman who had built an empire from her late husband's ashes. But tonight she was just a woman with a broken heart and a decision that would shake the entire nation. She looked out at the corner near the old bus stop where a homeless man sat under a torn umbrella. His clothes were soaked through, clinging to his thin frame. His beard was long, tangled, wild. His feet were wrapped in strips of cloth instead of shoes. And yet, there was something in his eyes, something that made her driver, Musa, glance at her nervously through the rear-view mirror. "Madam," Musa said softly, "are you sure about this?" Adaeze did not answer. She simply nodded once and reached for the door handle. The rain hit her Chanel dress the moment she stepped out, but she did not flinch. Her heels clicked against the wet pavement as she walked slowly, purposefully, toward the homeless man. People stopped. A woman selling roasted corn dropped her tongs. A young man on an Okada braked so hard he nearly fell off. Because everyone recognized her. Everyone knew her face from the billboards, the magazines, the news. And now she was walking toward a beggar in the rain. She stopped in front of him. He looked up slowly, rain dripping from his lashes. His eyes were dark, deep, and painfully aware. "My name is Adaeze," she said, her voice steady despite the storm. The man blinked. "Emeka," he replied, his voice hoarse but strangely elegant. "Emeka Nwosu." She knelt. She actually knelt, right there on the wet pavement in her $12,000 dress. Gasps erupted from the small crowd that had gathered. Someone pulled out a phone. Someone else whispered, "Is she mad?" Adaeze reached into her clutch and pulled out a small velvet box. When she opened it, a diamond ring caught the last of the streetlight and threw it back like fire. "Emeka Nwosu," she said, tears mixing with the rain on her cheeks. "I have watched you for 3 weeks. I have listened to you speak to strangers about philosophy, about mathematics, about the stars. I don't know who you were before this street claimed you, but I know who you are now. And I am asking you, please, will you marry me?" The crowd exploded in shocked murmurs. Cameras flashed, someone screamed. But Emeka just stared at her. Then, slowly, his cracked lips parted, and he said the one word no one expected. "No." Adaeze's heart cracked in half. The crowd went silent. She stayed on her knees, the diamond ring trembling in her hand, the rain soaking through her hair. "No?" she whispered. Emeka looked at her with those deep, knowing eyes. "You don't know what you're asking, Madam Okonkwo. You don't know what you're touching." She swallowed hard. "Then tell me. Tell me what I'm touching, Emeka." He was silent for a long moment. The rain poured. The crowd waited. And then he said, "If you truly want to marry me, then you must promise me one thing." "Anything," she said instantly. He shook his head. "Don't say that. Not until you hear it." She waited. He leaned closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "Promise me that no matter what you discover about me in the coming months, No matter what shadows you find in my past, you will not run. Because, madam, I am not who this street has made me look like. And when the truth comes out, it will shake your entire empire." Adaeze's breath caught in her throat, but she did not hesitate. "I promise." He nodded once. Then, slowly, he took the ring from her trembling hand and slipped it onto his own weathered finger. "Then yes, Adaeze Okonkwo, I will marry you." The crowd erupted. Phones flashed. Someone was crying. Musa opened the car door, and just like that, the billionaire widow drove into the night with a homeless stranger who had just made her a promise that would change her life forever. The ride back to Banana Island was silent. Emeka sat in the passenger seat, his hands folded in his lap, staring out at the passing lights of Lagos. He did not speak. He did not ask where they were going. He simply breathed, slowly, deeply, as if he had not truly breathed in years. Adaeze watched him from the corner of her eye. Up close, she could see the years the street had put on him, the hollow cheeks, the calloused hands, the deep lines around his eyes. But she could also see something else. A dignity, a stillness. The kind of stillness that only came from surviving something no one else could imagine. When they pulled into the massive gates of her estate, Emeka finally spoke. "This is your home?" "Ours now," she said softly. He turned to look at her, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Not gratitude, something deeper, something like recognition, as if he had seen this place before. Inside the mansion, her personal staff had been alerted. Grace, her housekeeper of 15 years, took one look at Emeka and pressed her lips together. But she said nothing. She had learned long ago that Madame Adaeze did not need approval, only loyalty. "Please prepare the West guest suite," Adaeze said. "Hot bath, fresh clothes, and a full meal." Grace nodded and disappeared. Adaeze turned to Emeka. "Come, I'll show you to your room." He followed her up the grand marble staircase, his tattered feet leaving faint wet marks on the polished stone. She led him to a suite larger than most homes in Lagos, with a king-size bed, a private balcony, and floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the lagoon. He stood in the doorway, unmoving. "Emeka?" she asked gently. He turned to her, and there were tears in his eyes. "It has been 11 years since I have slept in a bed." Her heart broke a little more. She left him then, allowing him privacy to bathe and change. When he emerged an hour later, freshly shaved and dressed in the tailored clothes she had provided, Adaeze had to grip the banister to steady herself. Because the man walking down her stairs was not the homeless beggar she had knelt before. He was tall. His shoulders were broad beneath the white linen shirt. His jawline was sharp, aristocratic. His eyes, now that they were free of the shadow of his beard, were the kind of eyes that made a woman forget her own name. He looked like a king who had been in exile. He looked like power. He looked like a secret. And Adaeze knew, in that moment, standing on the marble staircase of her billion-dollar home, that she had just made either the best decision of her life or the most dangerous one. They ate dinner together on the terrace, grilled sea bass, jollof rice, plantain, and fine wine. Emeka ate slowly, savoring each bite as if it were his last. Adaeze watched him, unable to eat. Finally, she spoke. "Tell me, Emeka, tell me who you were before the streets took you." He set down his fork. He looked at her for a long time, and then he began to speak. "I was born in Enugu," he said quietly. the only son of a professor and a doctor. I studied at Cambridge, mathematics and economics. I came home at 24 and started my own investment firm here in Lagos. By 30, I had built it into one of the largest in West Africa. Adaeze stared at him. "What was the name of your firm?" He looked at her steadily. Nwosu Capital. Her wine glass slipped from her fingers and shattered on the marble floor. Nwosu Capital. She knew that name. Everyone in the Nigerian financial world knew that name. 12 years ago, Nwosu Capital had been the fastest-growing investment firm on the continent. And then, overnight, it had collapsed in one of the biggest financial scandals in African history. Its CEO had been accused of embezzling $300 million. He had disappeared before he could stand trial, presumed dead, or hiding somewhere in Europe. The whole country had hated him. She had hated him. "You," she whispered. "You are that Emeka Nwosu?" He nodded slowly. "I am." She stood up so fast her chair fell backward. "You stole $300 million, Emeka. You destroyed thousands of people. Investors killed themselves. Families lost everything. You are a criminal." He did not flinch. He simply looked at her with those deep, sad eyes. "Adaeze," he said quietly, "I did not steal a single naira. I was framed, and I have spent the last 12 years on the streets because I would rather starve than live as the man they made me out to be. I told you the truth would shake your empire. Now you know why. And now you must decide. Do you keep your promise, or do you throw me back to the rain?" For a long moment, Adaeze could not breathe. Everything in her, everything her late husband had taught her about business, about people, about trust, screamed at her to call security. To have this man dragged out of her house, to end this madness before it destroyed everything she had built. But she looked at him. She looked into his eyes. And she saw no lie. She saw only a broken man who had told her the most dangerous truth of his life. She sat back down slowly. She picked up her fork, and she said, "Then tomorrow, we start to prove your innocence." Emeka's eyes filled with tears, and for the first time in 12 years, he smiled a real smile. The next morning, Adaeze called her most trusted lawyer, Barrister Chinelo Achebe, to the estate. Chinelo arrived in a sharp red suit, her briefcase in hand, her face professional. But the moment she walked into the study and saw Emeka Nwosu sitting across from Adaeze, she nearly dropped her coffee. "Adaeze," she said carefully, "please tell me this is not who I think it is." "It is," Adaeze said calmly, "and he is my fiancé. And we are going to clear his name." Chinelo sat down slowly. She looked between them. Then she opened her briefcase, pulled out a notepad, and said, "Then start from the beginning, Emeka, and do not leave anything out." For the next 4 hours, Emeka told his story. How he had been the CEO of Nwosu Capital. How his second-in-command, a man named Terence Adeyemi, had convinced him to expand into new markets. How, without his knowledge, Terence had been running a shadow account, funneling client funds into offshore holdings. How, when the SEC investigation had begun, Terence had planted evidence pointing to Emeka. How Emeka's own signature had been forged on transfer documents. How, before he could defend himself, someone had tried to kill him. He showed them the scar on his shoulder where the bullet had grazed him. He had escaped Lagos with nothing but the clothes on his back. He had lived in the bush for 2 years. Then he had drifted to the streets of Ibadan, then Abuja, and finally back to Lagos. He had watched his own funeral on a stranger's television. He had watched Terence Adeyemi buy his company and his mansion. And he had done nothing, because he had believed that no one would ever believe him. Chinelo took notes furiously. When he finished, she looked up. Emeka, if what you're saying is true, and I mean if we can prove it, this will be the biggest legal case in Nigerian history. But we will need evidence, real evidence, documents, witnesses, something. Emeka reached into the pocket of his new trousers and pulled out a small, battered, waterproof pouch. He had carried it with him for 12 years, through the rain, through the bush, through the streets. He set it on the table. I have everything, he said quietly. I just needed someone to believe me long enough to open it. Adaeze reached across the table and took his hand. And she did not let go. The next 3 months were a whirlwind. Chinelo assembled a team of forensic accountants and investigators. Adaeze quietly funded the entire operation. Emeka moved into the estate permanently, sharing meals with Adaeze, walking with her in the gardens, and slowly, painfully, becoming a man again. But he refused to marry her officially until his name was cleared. I will not make you the wife of a criminal, he said. I will make you the wife of a free man, or I will make you nothing at all. So they waited, and they worked. And then, one morning in September, Chinelo burst into the estate with a stack of documents so tall she needed both hands to carry them. We have him, she said breathlessly. Emeka, we have Terence Adeyemi. The forensic accountants matched the forged signatures. We tracked the offshore accounts. We even found the hitman who tried to kill you. He turned state witness this morning. Emeka, the police are going to arrest Terence tonight. Emeka sank into his chair. His hands trembled, his eyes filled with tears. Adaeze wrapped her arms around him from behind and held him as he wept for the first time in 12 years. That night, Terence Adeyemi was arrested at his mansion in Ikoyi, the very mansion that had once belonged to Emeka. The story broke by morning. Every newspaper in Nigeria carried the same headline. Nwosu innocent. Adeyemi arrested. Billionaire widow reveals truth. Reporters swarmed the gates of the Okonkwo estate. Camera crews from BBC, CNN, and Al Jazeera flew in. And on the steps of the Federal High Court, 3 weeks later, Emeka Nwosu was officially exonerated of all charges. His assets, including his original mansion, his firm, and every naira that had been stolen from him, were ordered restored. He walked out of that courtroom a free man. And he walked directly into the arms of Adaeze Okonkwo, who was waiting for him on the courthouse steps, wearing white. They were married 3 months later, in a ceremony that broke the internet. 2,000 guests, the president of Nigeria, kings and queens from across Africa. The bride wore Vera Wang. The groom wore a traditional Igbo isiagu with a red cap that marked him as a chief of his ancestral village, a title that had been stripped from him in his exile and restored the moment his name was cleared. They exchanged vows under a canopy of white orchids. And when the pastor asked Emeka to say his vows, he turned to Adaeze, took both her hands, and said, You knelt in the rain for a man the world had thrown away. You made me a promise when I told you the darkest truth of my life. You did not run. You did not doubt. You fought for me when I could not fight for myself. And so today, in front of God and all these witnesses, I promise you this. Every breath I have from this moment forward belongs to you. Every naira I earn belongs to you. every dream I dream, you will be in it. Adaeze Okonkwo, you gave me back my life. Now, I give you back mine. There was not a dry eye in the church. But their story was not over. Not by a long way. Because Emeka Nwosu, once one of the most brilliant investment minds in Africa, was back. And he did not return quietly. Within a year, he had rebuilt Nwosu Capital from the ground up. But this time, he did something different. He merged his firm with Okonkwo Holdings. Together, he and Adaeze created the largest privately owned financial and industrial conglomerate on the African continent. They called it Okonkwo Nwosu Global. And they did not use it just to make money. They used it to change lives. Their first act was to launch the Second Chance Foundation. They took every naira that Terence Adeyemi had stolen and returned it, personally, to every family that had been destroyed by the original Nwosu Capital collapse. They tracked down widows whose husbands had killed themselves in shame. They found orphans whose fathers had lost their inheritance. And to each of them, Emeka and Adaeze went personally, with a check and an apology and a promise. You were forgotten, Emeka said to each one. But you are not forgotten anymore. Some people cried. Some people slapped him. Some people refused to speak to him. But every single family was repaid, in full, with interest. It cost him nearly $400 million. He did not care. The Second Chance Foundation grew. Soon it was not just about repaying old debts. It was about finding people who had been broken by life, the homeless, the widowed, the falsely accused, the forgotten, and giving them a real, genuine second chance. They opened rehabilitation centers. They opened schools. They opened business incubators for former street children. And every single facility carried the same words carved above its doors. No one is beyond saving. No one is beyond loving. No one is beyond a second chance. 2 years into their marriage, Adaeze discovered she was pregnant. She was 39 years old. The doctors had told her, after her late husband's death, that she would never have children. She had accepted it. She had grieved it. She had moved on. But now, life had one more gift to give her. When she told Emeka, they were sitting on the terrace where they had eaten their first meal together. He dropped his coffee cup. It shattered on the marble floor. And then he fell to his knees in front of her and pressed his ear to her stomach and wept. Their son was born on a Sunday morning in June. They named him Chidiebube, meaning God is glorious. He had his father's deep, knowing eyes and his mother's stubborn chin. And from the moment he opened his tiny fist and grabbed his father's finger, Emeka Nwosu was a changed man forever. He had thought Adaeze had saved his life, but he understood now that this child, his son, this was the real second chance. This was what he had been kept alive for. The years passed like pages in a beautiful book. Chidiebube grew into a laughing, brilliant boy who followed his father everywhere. 2 years later, a daughter joined them. They named her Amara, meaning grace. She looked exactly like her mother. She had her father's fierce intelligence, and she wrapped every man in the household around her tiny fingers from the day she was born. Emeka and Adaeze built a life of overflowing joy. They traveled, they laughed, they fought and made up. They watched their children grow. They watched their empire expand. They watched their foundation change tens of thousands of lives. But the moment that would define them, the moment that would be told and retold for generations, came 10 years after their wedding. It was the 10th anniversary of the Second Chance Foundation. They had rented out the Echo Convention Center in Lagos for a gala celebration. Every major dignitary in Africa was there. But the guests of honor were not the presidents or the billionaires. They were the graduates. 200 men and women who had once been homeless, once been forgotten, once been thrown away by society. Men and women who now had degrees, businesses, families, and futures because of the foundation. And when Emeka took the stage that night to give the keynote address, he did something that no one expected. He did not talk about business. He did not talk about numbers. He simply told his story. All of it. The rise, the fall, the betrayal, the 12 years on the street, the rain, the moment Adaeze knelt in front of him, the moment he had said no, the moment he had told her the truth, the moment she had believed him. And then, in front of 5,000 people and the eyes of the entire nation, he turned to his wife, who was sitting in the front row, holding their 2 children, and he said, "Adaeze, my love, my heart, my everything. 12 years ago, I lost everything. And 10 years ago, you gave it all back to me, and more. You did not just save my life. You gave me a family. You gave me a purpose. You gave me a reason to believe that the world is still good. So tonight, in front of everyone we love, I want to renew my vow to you. For the rest of my days, until my last breath, I am yours. And I am grateful. Every single day, I am grateful." Adaeze stood up, tears streaming down her cheeks, and walked to the stage. The children ran up behind her, and in front of the entire nation, the 4 of them stood together, holding each other, as the entire hall rose to its feet in a standing ovation that lasted 7 full minutes. There was not a person in that room who did not weep. There was not a person in that country who did not remember, from that day forward, that miracles are real, that love is real, that second chances are real, and that sometimes, just sometimes, the person you kneel before in the rain turns out to be the answer to a prayer you did not even know you were praying. Years later, when Emeka was an old man with silver hair, sitting on the terrace of the mansion where it had all begun, holding Adaeze's hand as the sun set over the Lagos lagoon, their grandchildren playing at their feet, he would look at her and whisper the same words he had whispered to her 10 years, 20 years, 30 years before. "Thank you for kneeling in the rain." And Adaeze, older now, wrinkles at the corners of her eyes, would smile that same smile that had knocked him off his feet on a wet Friday evening decades before. And she would whisper back, "Thank you for saying yes." And somewhere, in the golden light of the setting sun, the promise that had begun in the rain would continue on, unbroken, unshaken, and eternal. Because love, real love, does not just change lives. It rewrites them. It resurrects them. It redeems them. And that is the truth Emeka and Adaeze Nwosu spent the rest of their lives telling anyone who would listen. That no matter how broken you are, no matter how far you have fallen, no matter how much the world has forgotten you, there is always, always, always a second chance waiting for you. You only have to be brave enough to kneel. And you only have to be brave enough to say yes.